My name is Caleb Miller, and at 26 years old, I have spent the last 3 years of my life as a senior logistics coordinator for a Tier 1 defense contractor in Arlington, Virginia. My daily existence is defined by the high-stakes management of $4.2 million in military hardware shipments, where a single misplaced digit on a manifest could trigger a congressional inquiry or leave a battalion without critical supplies. I am a man of precision, of spreadsheets, and of cold, hard facts. Yet, as I sat at the mahogany dining table in our family home on a humid Tuesday evening, none of that professional weight mattered. My sister, Vanessa, leaned back in her chair, swirling a glass of $14 Cabernet Sauvignon she bought from the Safeway on the corner, and looked at me with a level of disdain usually reserved for a broken appliance. "This house just functions better when you are not in it," she sneered, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that felt practiced. "You make everything feel like a federal audit." I looked down at my plate, where a portion of overcooked salmon sat untouched. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the Howard Miller grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant hum of the central air conditioning unit laboring against the Virginia heat. My mother didn't look up from her phone, her thumbs scrolling incessantly through Facebook, while my father focused intently on cutting his potato as if it were a surgical procedure. I pay the mortgage on this house, I thought, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. I pay the $800 monthly utility bill that keeps that AC running, and I am the one who wired $4,000 last month to cover Vanessa's credit card debt so her car wouldn't be repossessed. But in the twisted ecosystem of the Miller household, financial stability was viewed as a clinical defect rather than a contribution. Vanessa continued her tirade, her gestures becoming more animated as the cheap wine emboldened her. She is 30, unemployed, and lives in a state of perpetual self-discovery, funded entirely by my 60-hour work weeks. To her, my insistence on a budget and my preference for a clean kitchen were not acts of responsibility, but symptoms of a controlling personality. She called me toxic, a word she used like a blunt instrument whenever I asked her to stop leaving dirty dishes in the sink or to contribute even $100 toward the groceries. The air in the room felt thick, smelling of lemon pepper seasoning and the metallic tang of resentment. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the same sensation I get when a shipment of Bradley fighting vehicle components is delayed at a port in Germany, but here there was no logistical solution. There was no rerouting the emotional cargo of a family that viewed my competence as an insult to their chaos. I watched her take another sip of the wine, the glass leaving a faint red ring on the white linen tablecloth I had purchased from Macy's for $300 last Christmas. She didn't see the tablecloth. She didn't see the house. She only saw a brother who reminded her of everything she refused to be. My mind flashed to my office, the dual 32-inch Dell monitors glowing with real-time tracking data, the hum of the server room, and the respect I commanded from men twice my age. There I was, a pillar of the supply chain. Here I was, a nuisance, a federal audit in a button-down shirt from Brooks Brothers. But as I looked at the three of them, a shift occurred deep within me. The data finally aligned. The cost of maintaining this infrastructure exceeded the emotional return on investment. I realized then that they were right about one thing. The house would function differently without me, because without me the lights would go out, the water would stop running, and the reality of their choices would finally arrive like an overdue invoice. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was the final inspection before I closed the account for good. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the truth was that I was a line item they could no longer afford to erase. The financial gap between my reality and the image my family projected was not just a discrepancy. It was a canyon that I was expected to bridge with my own blood and exhaustion every single day. While I spent my mornings navigating the complex logistics of multimillion-dollar hardware shipments, my personal life was a study in extreme frugality and self-denial. I drove a 2012 Silver Ice metallic Chevrolet Malibu with 142,000 miles on the odometer and a prominent dent in the rear bumper from a hit-and-run in a grocery store parking lot that I could never afford to fix. My wardrobe consisted almost entirely of $15 Massimo polos from Target that had begun to pill at the collar, while my shoes were worn-down Skechers that had seen better days 2 years ago. I pinched every penny, skipped every morning latte, and lived on generic brand oatmeal just to ensure the household accounts remained in the black. Meanwhile, my 24-year-old sister Brianna lived like a Kardashian on my dime, oblivious to the fact that her lifestyle was a house of cards built on my sacrifice. She moved through our suburban Ohio home with a sense of unearned regal authority, often sporting a $1,200 Gucci Double G leather belt cinched tightly around her waist and clutching a brand new iPhone 15 Pro Max in titanium blue. What she didn't realize, or perhaps what she chose to ignore, was that both of those luxury items were financed on high-interest credit cards that I was secretly paying off every month just to protect our family's fragile credit score from a total collapse. The sheer weight of the numbers lived in my head like a constant, throbbing headache. Every month, I transferred $1,850 of the $2,400 total rent for our four-bedroom house, leaving my parents and Brianna to scramble for the remaining $550, which they still somehow struggled to produce on time. I was the one who authorized the $412 payment to American Electric Power to keep the lights on and the central air humming against the humid Midwestern summer. I was the one who covered the $380 bi-weekly grocery tab at the local Kroger, ensuring the pantry was stocked with the organic kale and artisanal cheeses Brianna demanded while I ate peanut butter on generic white bread. The injustice of it was a bitter pill that I swallowed 3 times a day. I would sit in my dented Malibu after a 10-hour shift, watching Brianna pull into the driveway in the used Audi A4 I was also helping her insure, her arms laden with shopping bags from Easton Town Center. She would walk past me without a word of thanks, complaining about how exhausting her part-time job at the boutique was, while I calculated how many hours of overtime I would need to work to cover the upcoming quarterly property tax adjustment. I was the invisible engine of their comfort, the silent guarantor of their status, yet I was treated as a secondary character in my own home. They saw my frugality not as a virtue, but as a source of embarrassment, a vibe killer, that didn't fit the aesthetic Brianna curated for her Instagram followers. As I sat there in the sweltering heat of the driveway, the engine of the Malibu ticking as it cooled, I looked at the glow of the house I paid for and realized that the more I gave, the less I existed to them. I was a senior logistics coordinator by title, but in this house I was nothing more than an interest-free loan with a heartbeat. The contrast was becoming unsustainable, a logistical failure waiting to happen, and for the first time in 3 years, I began to wonder what would happen if I simply stopped delivering the goods. The betrayal was executed with the surgical precision of a tactical ambush at exactly 06:42 p.m. on a Tuesday that had otherwise felt entirely unremarkable. I sat at the scratched oak dining table in our suburban Ohio home, the air heavy with the cloying, acrid scent of burnt garlic and the steam rising from a mountain of overcooked Barilla spaghetti that had been boiled into a mushy, glutinous heap. Opposite me sat Brianna's boyfriend, Tyler, a 25-year-old high school dropout who had managed to avoid any form of gainful employment for the last 8 consecutive months. Yet there he was, leaning back in his chair with a nauseating sense of entitlement while wearing my favorite North Face Apex Bionic soft shell jacket that I had purchased for $149 last autumn. The sight of his unwashed hands resting on the sleeves of my property made my stomach churn more than the sight of the unseasoned pasta. My mother refused to look at me, her gaze fixed with an unnatural intensity on the cheap plastic salt shaker as she nervously toyed with its cap, while my father sat slumped in his seat, picking incessantly at a jagged chip in the rim of his stained coffee mug like he was trying to excavate a way out of the conversation. The silence was finally shattered by Brianna, who didn't even have the decency to put down her fork before delivering the killing blow. "We want you out by the 1st," she said, her voice dropping to a temperature that was as cold and clinical as a morgue slab in the basement of a county hospital. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest as the sheer audacity of the statement settled into the room. She looked me dead in the eye, her expression devoid of a single shred of the empathy I had earned through years of financial servitude. "Your structure is suffocating us, Caleb," she continued, her tone dripping with a rehearsed disdain that told me this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment outburst but a calculated coup. "You make this house feel like a prison with your constant talk of bills and budgets and your judgmental attitude every time we want to actually live our lives." The realization hit me like a physical strike to the solar plexus they had all met behind my back, likely in this very room while I was working a 12-hour shift at the logistics terminal, to plot the removal of the man who provided the very roof over their heads. Tyler smirked then, a slow and oily grin that revealed a set of teeth that hadn't seen a dentist in years, and I could practically see the gears of his parasitic mind turning as he realized he was about to move his meager belongings into my master bedroom. That room featured a $4,000 Simmons Beautyrest black mattress and a custom-built mahogany desk where I managed the logistics of international defense contracts. And the thought of him lounging there while I was cast out into the street was almost too much to comprehend. My mother finally looked up, but there was no apology in her eyes, only a dull, flickering resentment that I had forced her to choose between her hard-working son and the daughter she had always coddled into uselessness. My father remained silent, a broken man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life, and it became sickeningly clear that my role as the family's chief financial officer had been terminated without severance. The very person who ensured the American electric power bill was paid and the Kroger pantry was stocked was being evicted by the people who hadn't contributed a single cent to the $1,850 monthly rent in over 2 years. As the steam from the ruined spaghetti clouded the air, I realized that my mistake hadn't been being too structured. It had been providing a safety net for people who were more than happy to use the cord to strangle me. They wanted a life without my rules, but they had fundamentally failed to calculate the cost of the infrastructure that allowed those rules to exist in the first place. This was the moment the logistics of our relationship finally collapsed, and I knew that once I walked out that door, the entire house of cards was going to come down with a deafening crash. I did not argue, I did not scream, and I did not plead my case because years of managing high-stakes logistics had taught me that when a contract is breached beyond repair, the only logical move is to execute an immediate exit strategy. I simply stood up from that table of ruined spaghetti, grabbed my keys to the dented 2012 Chevy Malibu, and drove through the humid Ohio night until I found myself sitting in a cracked vinyl corner booth at a 24-hour Denny's at 02:15 a.m. The restaurant smelled of industrial-grade degreaser and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a flickering, sickly persistence that matched the static in my brain. I asked the tired waitress for a black coffee, $2.49 plus tax, and a stack of paper napkins which I smoothed out on the laminate tabletop. With a black ballpoint pen, I drew a stark T-chart that would serve as the autopsy of my relationship with my family. On the left side I wrote family loyalty in cramped, hurried script, and on the right I wrote financial hemorrhaging in bold block letters. As I began to reconstruct the last 3 years of my bank statements from memory, the numbers that emerged were staggering, a cold testament to my own enabling of their parasitic behavior. I accounted for the $1,850 monthly rent payments, the quarterly property tax adjustments, the $400 utility bills, and the endless stream of $400 grocery runs that vanished into Brianna's ravenous social life. I factored in the $6,000 down payment I had gifted for her used Audi A4 and the $3,000 I spent on my father's dental implants when his insurance failed him. When I finally tallied the bottom line, the figure was a soul-crushing $74,520. That was $74,520 of my life, my overtime, and my youth that had been poured into a bottomless pit of ingratitude. I sat there in the dim glow of the diner, staring at that napkin until the ink blurred, realizing with a sudden sharp clarity that love cannot be subsidized and that I had been paying for a seat at a table where I was never actually welcome. The realization was a clinical epiphany that stripped away the last remnants of my guilt. I had spent 36 months acting as a private bank, a safety net, and a silent benefactor, only to be told that my presence was a suffocating audit. If they wanted a life without my structure, if they wanted to live in a world where Tyler lounged in my master bedroom and Brianna paraded around in financed Gucci belts, they were finally going to get exactly what they asked for. I decided right then, amidst the clinking of cheap silverware and the distant sound of a highway patrol car's siren, that I would stop being a bank and start being a ghost. I would not wait until the first of the month to be evicted from a house that I effectively owned through my payments. I would initiate a total systems shutdown of the Miller household infrastructure. I pulled up my banking app on my phone, the screen illuminating my tired face, and began the process of deauthorizing every recurring payment and closing every joint account that bore my name. I was done providing the fuel for a ship that was actively trying to throw me overboard, and as I watched the status bars of my cancellations load, I felt the first breath of true freedom I had known in years. They wanted me out and I would give them exactly that, but they had no idea that when I left I was taking the entire foundation of their comfortable reality with me. The following morning at exactly 08:15 a.m., I sat in the reception area of a glass-fronted office building in downtown Columbus, waiting for a meeting that would dismantle the life I had spent 3 years subsidizing. Marcus Thorne was not the kind of attorney you hired for a simple property dispute. He was a high-stakes real estate specialist whose reputation for aggressive litigation was as sharp as the crease in his charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. His private office smelled of expensive mahogany high-end espresso from a Jura Z10 machine, and the cold, sterile scent of leather-bound law books. Without a word of greeting, I handed him a heavy manila folder containing 144 pages of meticulously organized bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and the original co-signed lease agreement for the suburban house I had been funding. Marcus flipped through the documents with a practiced, predatory speed, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers that represented my financial lifeblood. "They want you out," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face that revealed teeth like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Legally, Caleb, if you simply stop paying the $2,400 monthly rent, the landlord will eventually evict everyone, but that is a blunt instrument that would ruin your own credit score in the process, and we are going to do this surgically instead." We spent the next 3 hours in that climate-controlled sanctuary, the hum of the city traffic muted by triple-pane windows, as we documented every single cent of the $12,400 personal debt Brianna had accumulated on the credit cards I had been forced to manage. I showed him the line items for the $1,200 Gucci belt, the recurring payments for her high-tier cellular plan, and the countless $300 charges from boutiques that she had promised to repay with the job she never kept. Marcus took notes with a Mont Blanc fountain pen, his movements precise as he outlined a strategy that would flip the script on my family's betrayal. We weren't just looking at a lease termination. We were looking at a systematic recovery of assets and a legal severance of my liability. He explained the mechanics of a formal demand letter and the process of filing a civil suit for the unpaid personal loans, a move that would hit Brianna with the force of a freight train just as she thought she was inheriting my master bedroom. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction as I watched Marcus categorize my sister's vanity as a series of actionable liabilities. This was the logistics of retribution, a field I was beginning to find I had a natural talent for. While Brianna was likely at home planning how to redecorate my room with Tyler's stained furniture, I was authorizing a legal professional to dismantle her delusions of grandeur. Marcus pointed out that because I was a primary co-signer on the lease, I had specific rights to terminate the agreement early by paying a $6,000 buyout fee, a sum that was significantly less than the 18 months of rent I had left on the contract. By paying that fee, I would effectively remove my name from the legal obligation while simultaneously triggering a 30-day window for the remaining tenants to either prove they could cover the full $2,400 a month or face immediate eviction. I knew with absolute certainty they couldn't even cover the $400 utility bill, let alone the rent. As I signed the retainer agreement and wrote a check for Marcus's initial $3,000 fee, I didn't feel the sting of the expense. I felt the weight of the last 3 years finally beginning to lift, replaced by the heavy, satisfying realization that the federal audit Brianna had joked about was finally coming for her, and this time the results would be catastrophic. Family was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as I left Marcus Thorne's office and stepped out into the blinding Ohio sun, I knew that for the Millers, the sanctuary was officially closed for renovations. I spent the next 3 weeks operating in a state of total, calculated silence, moving through the house like a shadow while my family treated my impending departure as a long-awaited liberation. Every evening after returning from my 12-hour shifts at the logistics terminal, I retreated to my master bedroom and methodically packed my life into 12 heavy-duty 70-quart Sterilite containers that I had purchased from the Home Depot for $17 each. I carefully wrapped my high-end electronics and my Brooks Brothers shirts in industrial-grade bubble wrap, taping each lid shut with reinforced Scotch shipping tape, the rhythmic screech of the dispenser providing the only soundtrack to my exit strategy. While I worked in quiet, disciplined isolation, the rest of the house was alive with a festive energy that felt profoundly surreal. Brianna, Tyler, and even my parents seemed to have entered a collective state of euphoria, convinced that by removing me, they were finally ridding themselves of the cold, demanding auditor who insisted on the boring reality of balanced checkbooks and paid utility bills. The peak of their delusion manifested on my 19th day of silence when Brianna posted a New Beginnings reel on her Instagram, complete with a filtered sunset background and a slow-motion pour of a $90 bottle of Veuve Clicquot Yellow Label Brut. I watched the video on my phone while sitting on a crate in my emptying room, the blue light of the screen illuminating the bitterness in my eyes. She had purchased that champagne with the emergency Chase Sapphire credit card I had originally opened for her to use only in the event of a genuine medical crisis or a car breakdown. A card I had intentionally left active during this transition period to see exactly how far her entitlement would go. The notification for the $89.99 charge at a local Total Wine & More had hit my phone at 3:45 p.m., a final, expensive signature on her own financial death warrant. To her, that bottle represented a victory lap, a celebration of the fact that the person who reminded her of her failures was finally being purged from her life. She had no idea that the very transaction she was flaunting was being logged into the $12,400 debt folder Marcus Thorne was currently refining for the civil suit. They truly believed they had won the war of attrition, assuming that my silence was a sign of defeat rather than the quiet before a devastating logistical strike. Tyler had already begun moving his tattered gym bags and cheap unwashed hoodies into the hallway outside my door, staking his claim on my square footage with the stench of stale cigarettes and unearned confidence. My mother stopped making enough dinner for 4, pointedly setting the table for 3 while the scent of her mediocre cooking wafted under my door, a petty gesture intended to signal that I was already a stranger in my own home. My father wouldn't even look in my direction when we passed in the narrow corridor, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could ignore the fact that the man who paid for his dental implants was being treated like a squatter. They thought the auditor was finally gone, that the fun could finally begin without the suffocating presence of someone who cared about the first of the month. They were so blinded by the sparkle of $90 champagne and the thrill of their coup that they failed to notice the foundational cracks spreading beneath their feet. Every box I taped shut was a brick removed from their wall of protection, and as I looked at the 12 containers stacked neatly by the door, I realized they hadn't just won a room, they had inherited the full, unmitigated weight of a life they were fundamentally incapable of sustaining. The new beginnings Brianna was so eager to broadcast were about to meet the cold, hard reality of an unpaid 30-day notice, and I was going to enjoy being the ghost who watched the lights go out. The timing of the final blow was not a matter of impulse but a calculated logistical strike designed for maximum impact and total exposure, occurring at exactly 0900 p.m. during the height of Brianna's combined housewarming and surprise engagement party. The house was packed with 28 guests, including extended aunts from Cleveland and uncles from Cincinnati who had been fed a steady diet of lies about how I was finally moving out to find myself while Brianna and Tyler took over the family estate. I waited in my 2012 Chevy Malibu until the street was lined with cars, watching the warm glow of the windows and hearing the muffled bass of a Spotify party playlist through the siding of the house I still technically insured. I stepped out of the car wearing my best charcoal gray Indochino wool suit, freshly pressed and paired with a silk tie that cost more than Brianna's entire monthly contribution to the household, and I felt a cold, predatory stillness settle over me. I entered through the front door without knocking, moving through the crowd like a ghost haunting his own funeral while Tyler stood at the head of the mahogany dining table, a glass of that stolen Veuve Clicquot raised high as he began a slurred, self-congratulatory toast about their bright future in this home. I did not say a word, I did not interrupt his speech, and I did not offer a single greeting to the relatives who looked at me with a mix of pity and confusion. Instead, I walked with purpose toward the buffet table, navigating past a $60 shrimp cocktail platter from Whole Foods and a selection of artisanal cheeses that I knew were charged to my accounts earlier that afternoon. With a deliberate heavy thud, I placed a stack of 30 stapled packets directly onto the lace tablecloth, fanning them out so that the bold, red-inked headers were visible to anyone reaching for an appetizer. Each packet was a comprehensive financial autopsy of the Miller household, a 12-page dossier containing every bounce check from Brianna, every utility bill I had covered in full, and a copy of the $6,000 lease termination agreement I had signed with Marcus Thorne the week prior. At the very top of the stack, printed in high-definition black ink, was the formal 30-day notice to vacate issued by the landlord, effectively informing every guest in the room that the hosts were being evicted because they lacked the means to cover a single month of existence without my subsidization. The room began to go silent from the outside in, the laughter dying in the kitchen and the chatter fading in the living room as the first few aunts picked up the packets and began to read the cold, hard data of my betrayal. Tyler's voice faltered mid-sentence, his arms still raised with the champagne glass as he realized the auditor had not left, he had simply finished the report. I watched Brianna's face drain of color, the vibrant pink of her blush clashing hideously with the sudden, sickly paleness of her skin as she caught sight of the $12,400 civil suit summons pinned to the front of her personal copy. The smell of expensive perfume and shrimp cocktail suddenly felt suffocating, a floral mask for the rot I had finally exposed to the light of day. I looked my father in the eye, seeing the moment he realized the lights were going out on his comfortable, silent complicity, and then I looked at my mother, who was clutching a deviled egg like a life preserver while she stared at the itemized list of every dollar I had ever given them. I had provided the infrastructure for their lives for 36 months, but as of 09:02 p.m., the service was officially disconnected, and the cost of the reconnection fee was more than any of them would ever earn. I turned on my heel and walked out the door without a backward glance, the silence behind me more satisfying than any argument I could have ever won, leaving them to explain to 28 witnesses why their new beginning was starting in a courtroom. "Attention everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the sudden vacuum of the room with a steady, clinical precision measured at exactly 65 decibels. The volume of a man who no longer had to shout to be heard. I stood at the edge of the mahogany table, the very same table where I had been insulted over burnt spaghetti just weeks prior, but now I was the one holding the ledger of their lives in my hands. Since I am being officially evicted from this household for the crime of being too controlling and for making this home feel like a federal audit, I thought it only fair and logistically sound to provide the necessary transition documents to the new management, I continued, my gaze sweeping over the 28 guests who were now frozen with shrimp skewers and wine glasses halfway to their mouths. I opened the top folder of my charcoal suit and began reading the first item with the same detached professional tone I used to coordinate military hardware shipments across the Atlantic. Item number 1 is the monthly rent of $1,850, which is due in exactly 48 hours to the Property Management Office in Dublin, Ohio. And since my recurring ACH transfer has been deactivated as of 4 p.m. today, you will need to find a way to produce those funds or face an immediate 5-day pay or quit notice. The silence in the room deepened, becoming so heavy that I could hear the rhythmic hum of the Samsung refrigerator in the kitchen and the frantic, shallow breathing of my sister, Brianna. Item number 2 concerns the $4,300 in back taxes that Dad owes to the state. A debt that is no longer being deferred or mitigated by my monthly structured payments into the escrow account I established 2 years ago to keep the collectors from the front door, I stated, watching as my father's face turned a shade of gray that matched the dust on his neglected tool bench. I turned the page of the packet, the crisp white paper snapping in the air like a gunshot, and looked directly at Tyler, whose smirk had been replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Item number 3 is perhaps the most critical for tonight's festivities, as the lease for this entire property is officially terminated as of midnight tonight because I have exercised the early buyout clause in my contract for the sum of $5,000, a move that legally severs my liability and leaves the current occupants exactly 30 days to either qualify for a brand new lease at the current market rate or vacate the premises entirely. I watched the realization of their new reality ripple through the extended family, the aunts and uncles whispering urgently as they looked at the itemized bills and the legal notices I had distributed like party favors. Brianna tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out against the wall of data I had erected around her. The $12,400 she had spent on my credit cards for designer belts and champagne was listed right there on page 4, cross-referenced with the dates and times of her Instagram posts. A digital trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to her financial ruin. I had spent 3 years being the silent engine of their comfort, the invisible hand that kept the lights on and the water running, and in 3 minutes of steady, calm narration, I had dismantled the entire infrastructure of their deception. I closed the folder with a sharp final click, the sound echoing off the crown molding I had personally paid a contractor to install last summer. My work here was done, the audit was complete, and the balance sheet was finally settled. I turned away from the buffet of unpaid-for luxuries and walked toward the front door, leaving them in the wreckage of a life they could no longer afford to live, knowing that by the time the sun rose, the illusion of the Miller family would be nothing more than a pile of debt and 30 stapled packets of truth. The room plunged into a vacuum of absolute silence so profound that you could literally hear the metallic click of a decorative pin dropping onto the polished Brazilian cherry hardwood floor I had paid $3,000 to have refinished last summer. My Aunt Sarah, the self-appointed moral compass of the family, reached out with a trembling hand and picked up one of the 30 stapled packets, her eyes widening as she began to flip through the meticulously documented pages of Brianna's financial recklessness. She let out a sharp, audible gasp that rippled through the gathered crowd of 28 guests as she reached page 4, which featured an itemized chronological list of the $8,400 Brianna had charged to my emergency lines for what she called aesthetic wardrobe essentials while I was surviving on 50-cent packets of Marukan ramen and generic store-brand coffee to keep the mortgage afloat. I stood there, a phantom in a charcoal Indochino suit, watching the collective realization wash over our extended family like a cold Atlantic tide as they saw the raw data of my exploitation laid bare in high-definition black ink. Brianna's face underwent a terrifying transformation, shifting from a pale, sickly white to a shade of deep, bruised purple I had never seen on a human being, her features contorting with a mixture of exposed shame and impotent rage. Tyler, sensing the total collapse of his comfortable parasitic lifestyle, tried to puff out his chest and take a heavy, aggressive step toward me, his boots scuffing the floor I still legally owned for another 3 hours. I didn't flinch or even adjust my stance. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out a formal, notarized cease and desist order prepared by Marcus Thorne, holding it up like a shield between my reality and his delusion. The document was printed on heavy 24-pound bond paper and bore the official seal of the Thorne Law Group, stating in no uncertain terms that any further harassment, physical intimidation, or unauthorized use of my remaining assets would result in immediate criminal charges and an escalation of the existing $12,400 civil suit. Tyler froze mid-stride, his eyes darting between the legal document and the sea of judgmental faces now surrounding him, as the guests began to murmur the figures they were discovering in their own packets. The air in the room, which had been filled with the scent of $90 champagne and shrimp cocktail, now felt heavy with the stagnant stench of a dying deception. I watched as my mother sank into a chair, her hand clutching a copy of the $412 electric bill she had assumed was magically being paid by the universe, while my father looked at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of his own siblings. There was no more space for lies, no more room for the narrative that I was the toxic auditor who suffocated their joy with my structure and my spreadsheets. I had provided the logistical framework for their entire existence. And now that the framework was being dismantled in front of a live audience, they were finally beginning to feel the weight of the gravity they had ignored for 3 years. I let the silence hang for a few more seconds, allowing the data to sink into their bones, before I turned my back on the wreckage of my family's pride. I walked toward the front door for the final time, the heavy oak entrance clicking shut behind me with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure as the Miller family bank, leaving them to navigate the dark, expensive reality of a world where the auditor had finally left the building. I looked directly at my mother, who was now weeping into a silk Hermes scarf that I had purchased for her 55th birthday, her shoulders shaking with a rhythmic, desperate grief that no longer moved me in the slightest. "You wanted to live without me," I told her, my voice remaining at that same steady, clinical 65 decibels, cutting through the stifling atmosphere of the room like a cold blade. "You said my presence was a suffocating federal audit and that this house functioned better when I was not in it, so now you finally get exactly what you asked for." I watched as she clutched the expensive fabric to her face, the salt from her tears likely staining the delicate silk, while the 28 guests stood in a frozen tableau of social horror around us. "I have officially vacated the lease and settled the early termination fee of $5,000 with the property management firm in Dublin, which means that as far as the law is concerned, I no longer exist within these 4 walls. The locks on the front and back doors will be professionally changed by the landlord's locksmith at 0800 a.m. tomorrow morning, and unless one of you can provide a fresh $4,800 security deposit and prove a combined monthly income of at least 3 times the $1,850 rent by noon, you will be escorted from the premises by the sheriff's department." I turned my gaze toward my father, watching as the brittle veneer of his patriarchal pride withered and collapsed in real time under the weight of the financial data I had laid bare. He had spent years treating me like a boring, overly cautious clerk whose only contribution was a series of annoying reminders about property taxes and insurance premiums, but in this moment, the reality of his situation finally hit him with the force of a physical blow. He realized that the boring son he had spent a lifetime overlooking was the only structural support keeping his entire world from sliding into a local homeless shelter. His hands, which were calloused from decades of hobbies I had funded, trembled as he looked at the itemized list of his own $4,300 tax delinquency that I was no longer willing to mitigate. He looked at the mahogany table, the Howard Miller grandfather clock, and the climate-controlled comfort of the living room, finally understanding that these were not basic human rights, but luxuries bought with my 60-hour work weeks and my $15 Target polos. Brianna stood frozen next to Tyler, her mouth still stained with the purple residue of the expensive wine she couldn't afford, looking at the $12,400 civil summons as if it were a death warrant. There was no more Instagram filter to hide the rot, no more emergency credit card to buffer the impact of her choices, and no more brother to play the role of the silent, reliable bank. I saw the panic beginning to set in among the extended family as they realized the party was over and that the hosts were effectively destitute, several of my aunts quietly setting down their drinks and reaching for their coats as the social contagion of failure began to spread. I didn't feel a surge of joy, nor did I feel a pang of regret. Instead, I felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of a logistics professional who had successfully rerouted a toxic shipment back to its origin point. I had spent 3 years ensuring they had a roof over their heads, and they had spent that time resenting the very hand that fed them, so it was only logically sound that they should now experience the full, unmitigated weight of their own independence. As I turned toward the door, leaving the house I had rebuilt for people who never deserved the effort, I knew that for the first time in my adult life, my own balance sheet was finally beautifully clear. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the truth was that I was finally going home to a life that belonged only to me. The fallout was absolute and clinically efficient, a cascading failure of a system that had relied entirely on a single point of failure that I had finally permanently removed. Within 72 hours of my departure from the house in suburban Ohio, the domestic infrastructure of the Miller family collapsed into a heap of high-interest debt and broken delusions that no amount of social media filtering could repair. Brianna and Tyler, who had so arrogantly claimed my master bedroom as their own, found themselves staring at the business end of an eviction notice that they had no legal or financial standing to challenge. With a combined savings account of exactly $42.87 and a credit score that had been decimated by my sudden withdrawal of support, they were forced to scramble into a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated brick building on the south side of town where the air smelled of damp mold and industrial exhaust. Gone were the $1,850 monthly rent payments I had provided and the $400 grocery runs at Kroger. In their place was a cramped room with a stained linoleum floor and a window that overlooked a rusted fire escape in a neighborhood where sirens provided a nightly soundtrack to their new reality. My parents fared no better, as the $4,300 in back taxes my father owed became an immediate, unmanageable crisis once my monthly structured mitigation payments ceased. Without my invisible hand balancing their ledgers and subsidizing their lifestyle, their credit scores tanked overnight, falling like a lead weight in a vacuum and disqualifying them from any reputable rental market in the county. They were forced to downsize with humiliating speed, selling off the furniture I had bought them just to cover the deposit on a double-wide trailer in a gravel lot parked 30 miles outside the city limits. The mahogany dining table where they had sat while Brianna called me toxic was sold on Facebook Marketplace for $300 to pay for a U-Haul rental, a pathetic fraction of the $74,520 I had gifted them over the last 36 months. I watched none of this in person, but the digital evidence of their desperation arrived in a relentless, frantic barrage of communication. Brianna sent me 142 text messages in a single 48-hour window, a digital autopsy of her mental state that ranged from sobbing apologies and pleas for a $500 loan to vitriolic outbursts where she screamed that she hated me through the screen of her financed iPhone 15 Pro Max. I watched the notifications scroll past on my own phone while I sat in my new quiet apartment in a secure building near the defense contractor's headquarters, the silence of my own space feeling like a luxury I had finally earned. I didn't respond to a single one. Instead, I opened my contacts list and systematically blocked every phone number and email address associated with the people who had treated my stability as a weapon against them. The $12,400 civil suit was already moving through the Franklin County court system, a cold piece of litigation that would ensure Brianna spent the next decade paying back the aesthetic lifestyle she had stolen from my future. I had spent 3 years ensuring they had every comfort only to be told I made life feel like a federal audit. And now they were finally living through the real thing without a consultant to save them. As I sat in the dim light of my new living room, The only sound was the hum of a high-end air purifier I had bought for myself. A reminder that the cost of my freedom was high, but the cost of staying would have been my soul. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the truth was that I was finally, beautifully alone. Today, I live in a 32nd floor high-rise apartment in the heart of the city. A space defined by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offer a panoramic, unobstructed view of the skyline and the distant, rhythmic flow of the interstate I once traveled in a dented Malibu. My new reality is one of quiet, climate-controlled luxury, featuring a 24-hour concierge who greets me by name and a secure underground parking garage for the 2024 Midnight Black Tesla Model S I finally treated myself to after years of financial martyrdom. The most staggering metric of my new life is not the view or the amenities, but the cold, hard data of my bank statement, which shows that my total monthly overhead is $1,200 less than what I was hemorrhaging to support 3 ungrateful adults in a suburban house that didn't even belong to me. I no longer wake up to the sound of Tyler's unwashed gym bags hitting the floor or the sight of Brianna's latest $1,000 vanity purchase sitting on the kitchen counter. Instead, I wake up to the soft hum of an automated espresso machine and the absolute, pristine silence of a life that is entirely under my own logistical control. My credit score has climbed to a near-perfect 790, a number that represents more than just borrowing power. It is a testament to the fact that I am no longer a co-signer for someone else's catastrophic failures. The $12,400 civil suit against Brianna is proceeding through the courts with the relentless momentum of a freight train, managed by Marcus Thorne while I focus on my career and my own well-being. I have replaced the $15 Target polos with custom-tailored shirts that actually fit, and the overcooked spaghetti has been replaced by meals that don't taste like resentment and burnt garlic. There is a profound, almost spiritual peace that comes from knowing that every kilowatt of electricity used in this apartment and every drop of water from the rainfall showerhead is paid for by me, without the parasitic drain of a family that viewed my competence as a personal insult to their chaos. I didn't have to scream to be heard, I didn't have to beg for respect, and I didn't have to wait for them to change a nature that was fundamentally rooted in entitlement and manipulation. I simply applied the same high-stakes logic to my personal life that I apply to defense contracts. When a partner becomes a liability and the cost of maintenance exceeds the value of the asset, you terminate the agreement and move on to a more viable operation. I raised my standards, I enforced my boundaries with the cold precision of a legal injunction, and then I simply walked out into the life I had already bought and paid for 10 times over. The Millers are now a closed file. A historical footnote in a ledger that has finally been balanced to the last cent looking out over the city lights at 02:15 a.m. I no longer feel like a weary auditor trapped in a federal nightmare. I feel like the CEO of my own existence, and the view from the top is clearer than I ever imagined it could be. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and in the end the only person who stayed to build a real future was me.